Today, we're looking at a spot where most players don't even think to overbet. And even the ones that do overbet here think they're doing so with the goal to balance their overbetting range. But that's not the real objective, and by misunderstanding that, they end up misusing overbets in general. So in this video, we'll fix this leak together. Let's get started. Good morning, how we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and today we have to talk about overbetting and make sure we fully understand why and how to use it. So let's do it through the lens of this hand. Alright, so say we're playing 2-5, action folds around to us on the button, we open to 15 or 3 big blinds with ace-jack, the big blind is the only caller, board is ace-jack-5 rainbow, giving us top 2, which is pretty excellent, and of course our hand here is definitely strong enough where we would want to be playing for stacks if possible. But this is a situation where most players don't even have overbetting on their radar, they're not even considering overbets on the flop most of the time, they normally reserve that for the river, maybe turn plus river, but if you don't think about it on the flop at all, I promise you you're leaving money on the table. And I think it's useful to look at this spot against two different opponent types, since your overall strategy can be quite different, but the thought process and the overbetting can still be in there if you understand what you're looking for. So let's look at this spot first against a weaker opponent. So here is a very reasonable way that we might break up our betting range against a weaker opponent. With our 2-pair plus hands, we can overbet at, let's say, 120% pot. With top pair good kicker, 70%, top pair weak kicker, 50% if vulnerable, maybe 33% if not vulnerable. With our gut shots and vulnerable pairs, half pot, backdoor equity, 1/3 pot, and with our trash, completely dominated equity type stuff, maybe we just check that instead and go from there. And of course, by using the bigger bet size with the stronger hand earlier in the hand, right, since we're on the flop here, we can create a situation where when our opponent does continue, we can have a much bigger final pot size compared to using a smaller size or even more of a quote default size here. Now this strategy definitely meets our overall exploitative strategic objectives, which is really when we have a better hand, try to get as much money in as we possibly can. Pretty simple. And if you're looking at this and you're like, well, this is incredibly face up, super straightforward, yes, you're exactly right? We're talking about playing against a weaker opponent. They're probably not thinking about your hand, your range all that much. They're really just focused on what they have. If they have a piece, they're probably going to get fairly inelastic and stick around, and if they don't, well, they're probably folding, and you're not making gigantic pots with weak hands yourself. So yes, very straightforward. But what if our opponent instead is a stronger player, maybe even an elite reg? Well, let's talk about that and what our strategy might look like against them instead. Now taking this exact same spot but switching our opponent over to an elite reg profile, let's create a strategy wrapped around two different bet sizing options. We can either check, we can bet 33% pot, or bet 120% pot. Well, in this situation, here's what our strategy might look like. With 2-pair plus, we can mostly bet 120% pot and sometimes 1/3. Top pair good kicker, mostly overbet, sometimes 1/3. Top pair weak kicker, 33% if vulnerable, and we can check if it's non-vulnerable. Gut shots and vulnerable pairs, we can mix between 33% and 120 overbet. The backdoor equity, maybe 1/3, and with our trash, dominant equity, non-vulnerable pairs, again, we can check that as well, just like we did against the weak player. Now, for what it's worth, solvers also tend to overbet a lot on flops with 2 broadways, just like this one. However, solvers will also include extremely weak hands such as King 4 suited and even Queen 4 suited as overbets here too. But what happens here is that smart players look at this situation, they say, okay, I can't use the same strategy I used against the weak opponent, so I have to use something that's more balanced, maybe even perfectly balanced if possible. But let's be very honest about the strategy we're laying out against the elite player. We're not looking at something that's perfectly balanced. In fact, if you look at this is not a perfectly balanced strategy even in the GTO sense. There aren't enough bet sizing options given to the solver, we're not overbetting as many backdoor equity hands as the solver would, and as such this is definitely not perfectly balanced. And this is the pitfall that most smart players end up running into. They think the fix here is to make sure that they are perfectly balanced. And the fact of the matter is that pseudo-balance is going to be far better here. So again, looking at the proposed strategy, notice that we're not trying to be perfectly balanced or even perfectly unexploitable. Rather, we're trying hard enough to exploit that the exploit continues working. Again, not totally GTO balanced by any stretch. We're still trying to build the pot when we're strong, but we're trying to do so in a way that pseudo-balanced and our elite reg opponent will likely not even realize that we're exploiting them in the first place. And if you don't believe me, look very carefully at the proposed strategy and see exactly which way it tends to bend and who it tends to favor in the long run. So again, too many players misdiagnose why overbets work. They think it's because of balance, but it's actually because their opponents don't adjust their calling ranges enough. And this is all wrapped around the inelasticity principle, where essentially players tend to be inelastic, meaning that when they have a hand that they deem strong enough, they're more likely to continue kind of regardless of the size, versus if they're weak, they're just going to fold anyway. Elastic means they're going to be very, very price sensitive. Inelastic is the opposite. And this is very obvious when we look at the proposed strategy against the weaker opponent, since we're betting bigger and bigger with our stronger and stronger hands and smaller with our weaker and weaker hands. And while we can't push the exploit quite that far in quite the same way against the elite opponent, since they will obviously pick up on it, notice that we still have that overall idea embedded in the strategy, but it's not nearly as straight up and transparent as it is against the weaker opponent. Now that being said, if you find out that your elite opponent is actually folding more often than they should against that overbet, then of course you can start weighting that overbetting range further towards weaker holdings like gut shots and backdoor equity. Of course, be careful that you don't push it too far, since an elite opponent is more likely to catch on faster and adjust faster, so at least be aware of that in the long run. So hopefully that gives you more context and confidence the next time you find yourself in an overbet situation. And if you want even more examples, more data, more focus on exploitative strategy, make sure to pick up my newest book, The Exploitative Edge, today. It's available right now at redchippoker.com or on Amazon if you like Kindle or paperback, or even on Audible if you like audiobooks. Whichever way you get it, I hope you massively enjoy The Exploitative Edge today. And for what it's worth, I mentioned earlier how smaller versus larger sizings can have a huge impact on the final pot size. If you're interested in seeing just how big of an impact it has, I made a full video on that. Just click this card right over here to watch it next. I think you're really going to enjoy that one too. But either way, thank you so much for hanging out today. Hope you enjoyed. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to let me know. And of course, as always, good luck out there and happy grinding.